Very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
On behalf of Teamwork Arts and the British Library, good morning and welcome back to the third day of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our first session today is Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. Christina Lamb in conversation with Taran N. Around the world, a woman's body is still very much a battlefield, and hundreds and thousands of women bear the invisible wounds of war. Award-winning foreign correspondent Christina Lamb has worked extensively in war-torn areas and combat zones for more than 30 years. Her latest book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, is an essential, groundbreaking examination of how women experience sexual abuse in modern conflicts. In this eye-opening session, she gives voice to some first-hand accounts of women who have survived conflict, warfare, and rape at the hand of armies, terrorists, and militias who use this as a weapon to humiliate, oppress, and carry out ethnic cleansing. Christina speaks to author and journalist Taran N of the suffering and bravery of these women in war and brings out the stories of those fighting for justice. Christina Lamb is a chief foreign correspondent at the Sunday Times and one of UK's leading foreign journalists. She has been awarded Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times, as well as Europe's top war reporting prize, the Prix Bayou. She's the best-selling author of Fable Kabul, The Africa House, Waiting for Allah, The Swing Circles of Herat and House of Stone. She also co-wrote the international bestseller, I Am Malala, with Malala Yousafzai, and The Girl from Aleppo with Nujeen Mustafa. Taran Khan is the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. She's a journalist and non-fiction writer and writes on gender, culture, and cinema. Our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org and will also be available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can log back on. Please do ask questions and comment by typing in the comment section. Love for you to consider donating to help us with JLF London at the British Library by clicking on the donation link. We would also like to thank Launchora, our podcast partner, for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, our bodies, their battlefield. What war does to women. Christina Lamb in conversation with Taran Khan. Over to you, Taran.
Thank you, Ankur. Welcome, Christina. Wonderful to see you again and to be a part of this virtual session today at the Jaipur Litfest and the virtual British Library. Christina, I'm going to start by noting your book, which is over 400 pages long. It goes across 4 continents. You visit countries, you talk about countries from Argentina, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Bangladesh, Iraq, and others. And you also take us across a long period of time. I mean, you mentioned the aftermath of the Second World War to the more recent Yazidi women who were kept as sex slaves by ISIS fighters. So clearly this is an issue of massive proportions, of international significance, and yet one of the reasons you said you wanted to write this book was because you were angry that the voices of these women were not being heard. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book and why you felt this way?
I will. Thanks, Taran. Great to see you again from a distance, and great to be part of this wonderful event. I'm so glad that we're able to do things like this in these strange times that we find ourselves in. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, it's a difficult subject to talk about on a Sunday, and I wrote this book, as you rightly say, because I was angry. I had worked for more than 30 years as a foreign correspondent in many different countries, often covering conflict. And I always felt that what happened to women in conflict was very much the untold story, that focus tended to be much more on what happened to the men. And I was always much more interested in the sort of human side of, in terms of how people keep their lives together during war. And, you know, because even in midst of war, you look at places like Afghanistan, which, you know, where war's been going on for 40 years. So most people have only known war, and yet they still have to go to work, educate their children, protect them, get married, have children. So all these things still go on. And it always seemed to me that it was very much the women that were facilitating that, and that they were the heroes actually of these stories. However, there's another side of what happens to women in war, and that is the brutality and the way that people use violence against women in order to achieve their objectives. And I felt that over the last, and this has always happened in war, of course. I mean, if you go back through history, Herodotus, the very first Western history, starts with accounts of abductions of women by the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Persians. So it isn't anything new, but we are in the 21st century, and I felt very angry that over the last few years, I seem to have seen more violence and brutality against women than in the whole of my career. And I found that very difficult to understand why that should be happening and why nobody seems to be doing anything about it. So in particular, I think the first case which really brought this home to me was what was happening to the Yazidi women in Iraq. So the Yazidis, as you remember, were when ISIS went into Iraq, the Yazidis are a minority that live between Iraq and Syria, and thousands of Yazidi girls and women were abducted and kept as sex slaves by ISIS fighters and traded one to another. And when I met some of those girls and they told me what had happened to them, you know, it was just really so shocking and so difficult to believe that something like that was happening at this time. And, you know, girls told me about being taken to this Galaxy Cinema, which was really a slave market where they would be separated into groups, whether they were considered ugly or beautiful. And then the fighters would come and select which one they wanted to take, touch their hair, touch their breasts, and then take them away with them. And one of the Yazidi girls I met told me how she was traded 12 times. She said she felt like a goat just being passed from one to another. So there was the Yazidis. Then around the same time, I was traveling a lot in Nigeria, and you might remember the Chibok girls who were abducted from their school in northern Nigeria, more than 250 of them in the middle of the night, and which got, you know, big headlines for a couple of weeks. But actually, you know, that was 5 years ago, and still most of those girls are missing and everybody's forgotten about them. And actually, when I went and talked to people in northern Nigeria about this, I discovered that, you know, this was, although this had got a lot of attention, this was happening all the time. There were thousands and thousands of girls that had been taken by Boko Haram fighters and kept as what they called their bushwives. And then in 2017, I was in Bangladesh covering the exodus of Rohingya from Myanmar. And again, the stories that the women I met there told about being tied to banana trees and gang raped by Burmese soldiers were just horrendous. And also the scale of it. I mean, you know, 700,000 people crossed that border, and every woman that I met, and the majority of people coming were women, had similar stories. It was just unbelievable. So having all these things happen within a space of 2 or 3 years just really made me angry that why is all this going on and no one is really doing anything about it.
It's for all the reasons you mentioned, it's very interesting to know throughout the book that you make the point that, as you say, rape and sexual violence has been considered as sort of part of the eternal terrain of war, and or some sort of collateral damage or like a secondary atrocity in some way. And why do you feel that it's so important as readers, and also to the women you spoke to, that it be understood and treated as a war crime, that it's a weapon of war as deliberate as you write, as a machete or a Kalashnikov?
It is a war crime, and that, you know, it's the world's most neglected war crime, frankly. It's very little prosecuted. I mean, even in the cases such as the Yazidi, where there was a lot of international outcry, there has not been a single ISIS fighter prosecuted for rape. And I went to, and it's not that there aren't trials going on of ISIS fighters. In Iraq, they've tried thousands of people. I mean, it's questionable sometimes the justice in that these trials are very quick. People are being convicted within 20 minutes. But I spoke to the Chief Justice and asked him why are none of these people being actually charged with sexual violence or rape or abduction of the women. And he almost laughed. He said, well, how does that matter compared to the killing of people? And this is one of the problems, that lots of people at the end of wars, and I would say, I don't completely generalize, but tend to be men that negotiate the end of wars, don't consider it a serious issue in comparison. And yet every single woman that I met from all of the different countries I went to said to me, I would rather have died than be in this situation of living with this for the rest of my life. Many of them have been forced out of their communities. They've been stigmatized. This is the awful thing. They are the victims, and yet they're the ones that are being stigmatized in their communities, being forced to flee, sometimes living in just terrible conditions because they have no way of supporting themselves. And yet they're the ones that did nothing wrong. Something terrible was done to them. So it feels to me that we need to shift the focus much more on the perpetrators and actually bringing justice against them. And I mean, some of the people I met, I will never forget a 16-year-old girl, a Yazidi girl who I met in Germany. Now, Germany, one state in Germany, one province, Baden-Württemberg, have done a very interesting thing, which was the governor of Baden-Württemberg, when he heard what had happened to the Yazidis, he was so horrified that he actually arranged to bring 1,000 of the women who had managed to escape to Germany for 3 years to help them and give them counselling, any physical treatment that they needed, medical treatment, and just sort of enable them to get into a better position to restart their lives. And so I went to Germany and met some of these women and they're in kind of remote places. And one of them was a 16-year-old girl who had been kept by this really fat ISIS judge who raped her every night. And she told me that despite all the terrible things he was doing to her, the worst night of her life was when he brought a 10-year-old girl back and raped her in the room next door. And this girl listened to the 10-year-old crying for her mother the whole night. I mean, these are stories that are so awful and that you'll never forget, you know, and it's so difficult for the women to tell. And I have to say that the women that spoke to me, this book is a collection of their accounts. I don't paraphrase what they say, it's their words. And they were so brave to tell their story, to talk about, you know, anybody listening who may have gone through any of this experience will know it's, you know, it's the hardest thing to possibly recount. And so they were astonishingly brave to speak out. And they deserve to be listened to and something to be done about it.
You also, the other thing I was really struck by while reading your book, Christina, is, as you say, the whole idea of accountability for these crimes, and how the woman after woman who you spoke to said, no, I want the perpetrators to be tried for what they did to me, besides being tried for the other crimes of war. Can you tell us a little about the legal framework for accountability, which I was quite surprised to see as a very short history. By reading your book, I realized that it's not, you know, the whole idea of treating these as war crimes and international courts is an extremely short story.
Yeah. Well, you know, as I said, through history, this has happened, but it doesn't mean that it's acceptable, right? And I hope that we have sort of higher standards of human rights in the 21st century than in ancient times when this was first happening. But the problem is that, you know, if you go back through more recent conflicts, this has never been considered as something that really should be taken seriously at the end of a war. So the Second World War is a very good example, because a huge number of women, as many as 1 or 2 million women, it's estimated in Germany, were raped by Russian soldiers when they went in to liberate Berlin. And I mean, horrendous stories which were kept quiet, you know, because this is also one of the problems, the sort of shame attached to it, that people feel that they can't speak out. And you know, at the end of that war, as we know, there were the Nuremberg trials, the first big international criminal tribunal to bring people to justice for what they'd done. But this was not part of it. There was nobody was brought to justice. You didn't just have what the German soldiers did. You had the Japanese soldiers who were setting up what they called comfort stations, abducting young girls and women throughout Southeast Asia and forcing them to be prostitutes for the soldiers. many of them very young. And again, there's been no justice, and in some cases, not even any acknowledgement of what happened to them. And so I met these really incredible women in the Philippines who now in their 80s, of course, who had been taken when they were 13, 14 and kept by Japanese soldiers, forced to have sex with them over and over again. And they have been fighting more than 70 years for justice and for acknowledgement. I mean, in the history books, in what's taught in the schools in the Philippines, there's no mention of these women. And when they finally managed to get permission to put up a statue in Manila for comfort women, it was taken down after 4 months because the government in the Philippines didn't want to offend the Japanese, who are an important trade partner. So over and over again, we see the interests of women being forgotten in the service of what other people seem to think are more important issues. And where we have had, and I don't want, this is not completely bleak, because there have been some amazing, courageous women who have managed to get justice. And, I think people often, when they think about this issue, depending on their age, if they're my age, probably remember the war in Bosnia in the 90s as the time when this really became a major issue, and it became a big issue in Europe, the idea that there was, because rape was used a lot against women in that war, and there were rape camps set up. And so the idea that there were rape camps in the centre of Europe was something very shocking to people. And so there were tribunals at the end of that war for war crimes, and rape was part of it. But actually, I was very shocked when I went to Bosnia and talked to women that not many people were brought to justice, considering you're talking about 25 to 30,000 women. Maybe 90 men were brought to justice. So lots of the women I spoke to there said that they see their perpetrators, in coffee shops or in local areas, that some of them are working as police, and yet they did these terrible things.
Yeah, and you also write at length about Rwanda and how the incredible, the way the women there simply insisted on, getting justice in a way. And they created this incredible international precedent. And yet their own lives remain tragically unchanged at the end of that process.
The Rwanda case is really interesting, because I think not many people, I certainly didn't realize until I started looking into this, that the first place on earth where rape was prosecuted as an international war crime was in the Rwanda tribunal, which took place in Arusha in Tanzania. And the reason that happened was, again, because of incredible bravery of 5 women that, literally risked their lives to go and give accounts of what happened to them. And the interesting thing, this first person that was brought to justice was a mayor, John Paul Akayesu, of a small town called Taba, about an hour outside of Kigali. And he was actually being tried not for sexual violence, he was being tried for genocide and other things that happened. And some of the women giving testimony in the trial started speaking about the rape. So one woman was talking about things, and then she said, and then he raped me about. So the prosecutor literally said, well, moving on, we're not really interested in that. Fortunately, there was a female judge from South Africa, Judge Pile, as one of the judges, and she said, hang on a minute, this woman's come all the way here and to testify, let's hear what actually happened to her. And then this woman recounted the rape and said that actually lots of people were being raped in the town hall. So then it was because of that, they then ended up actually stopping the trial and adding the charge of sexual violence, and then bringing women to come and talk about it. And these particular women who testified, you know, they were mostly poor women from this village, and they managed to change history. Basically, they got this conviction, which was incredible. But it's quite shocking because you go back. So that was in '98, 20 years on. First, they can't understand why this is still happening, because they thought what they'd done would actually mean that this stopped. And then they hear about what happened to the Yazidis and others. And so they find that very difficult to understand. But also their own lives are miserable. They're still living in terrible conditions. They don't have electricity. They don't have food. One of them selling lumps of charcoal in the market in suburb of Kigali, you know, really scraping to get by. And you think, my God, these women did something so phenomenal, and yet they're living in misery. And that's really the problem, I think, that where there have been convictions, and there have been some, it's through the bravery and determination and persistence of some women, and it's not a sort of general institutional change.
Yes, and part of what makes this book so special to read are the voices of these women who you say persisted, and it's incredible how they just managed to make some kind of change. There are also a few men there who are beacons of hope despite everything. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so of course, when you write a book like this and you hear such terrible stories, and it does start to make you think about, you know, is there some kind of dark side within men, that if they were in this situation of war where anything goes, that they would also, you know, men that you know and love would also turn into a monster like this. So, you know, it's a kind of something that you think about. And I do think there's a very interesting book for somebody to do about the perpetrators. But some of the great heroes in my book are men, and some quite unlikely. One of them is a beekeeper from Aleppo who told me that because he kept bees, he became very interested in women's rights, because of course the hive is controlled by a queen bee. And he said, you know, he found that, you know, that it's very impressive the way that they organize everything. And yet he lived in a society where women were not supposed to talk about things, not supposed to have opinions, just to follow what the men said. So he started thinking much more about women's rights because of the bees. So when he heard about the Yazidi girls being taken by ISIS and forced into being sex slaves, he decided he would do something about it. And so he actually personally rescued more than 300 girls at, you know, tremendous risk. And it was interesting because he said, you know, never done anything like that in his life. But he did know about trading because of trading the honey that he produced. So he kind of contacted traders and talked to them. And they said, you know, you need to look at the cigarette smugglers and how they smuggle the cigarettes. And maybe you can use the same ways to smuggle the girls out. So he sort of used that and came up with all sorts of ruses of like because you had to kind of establish where the girls were being kept and how you could get them out. So he did things like renting properties and having like a fake bakery, which would be delivering bread, just so that he could establish contact with girls that he'd been told about. So, I mean, amazing man. And then, I mean, one of the most remarkable, perhaps the most remarkable man I have ever met, a man called Dr. Denis Mukwege from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who's a gynecologist who set up a hospital called the Panzi Hospital in Bukavu. And they have treated 55,000 women and girls who have been raped. He risks his life to speak out about this issue. He is, I can tell you, in the last couple of weeks has been getting a lot of death threats again. He got the Nobel Peace Prize year before last with Nadia Murad, the Yazidi girl. or spokeswoman, because of their work on this issue. But he says, you know, that this isn't about getting awards or honours, it's about changing things. And he's rather frustrated that at the Nobel ceremony, he spoke in a very impassioned way about this and what was happening. And everybody applauded him. But then he said they didn't actually do anything. It didn't make any difference. And in fact, the week that I was at his hospital last year, a 6-month-old baby and a 4-year-old girl were brought into the hospital who had been raped. I mean, it's hard to even get your mind around that. And he said that this is one of the problems, that it's because there's total impunity, people just think they can do absolutely anything, and that he's now seeing younger and younger girls and babies being brought in, which is, you know, just really difficult to understand.
Christina, like, this is such an interesting book, and these are such compelling stories that we should talk about them much longer. But I just have one more question for you before we take questions from the audience. And everything you've said and everything you've written just shows how complicated this entire question is. And there's this tension between legal action and also sort of inaction. The fact that simply having popular opinion is not enough, as we saw in Nigeria. What do you think? I mean, where will it end? How do you think? Is it the solution to have more women involved in creating solutions for peace? As you quoted someone in your book mentioning the abysmal representation of women in negotiating peacetime accords or ending conflict.
Yeah, well, absolutely. This is a really important point. I mentioned the Rwanda case, where the reason that the woman talking about rape was listened to was because there was a female judge.
Yes.
And it is fascinating when you look at where there have been successful convictions in recent years in places like Guatemala, various countries. Every time there has been a female judge. So I think that makes a huge difference. I think that definitely in peace negotiations, I mean, there's been study after study that show that peace negotiations are more successful, last longer if you have women involved in the negotiations. And I mean, an interesting time, because as you know, the Afghan peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government and others just opened yesterday, which, you know, is great news, although there's huge differences, you know, to breach. But, you know, hope that this war of so many years may finally come to an end. And, you know, initially there were not women going to be on the negotiators, and women have had to really fight and lobby. And yesterday, of the 20 group of 20 that were there were 3 women. Actually, there will be 4 out of the 21, but one of the women was unwell. And, you know, I spoke to one of the women, Fazia Kufi, who has had assassination attempts, including just last month.
While she's in the delegation.
And, you know, there she is sitting in front of the Taliban who tried to kill her and who imprisoned her husband, who then died, who stopped her from doing studies as a medical student when they were in power because they stopped women studying. So, you know, she personally knows what it's like to suffer as a result of them. I think it's so important to have, you know, she's there for all Afghans, but she's not going to allow women's rights to be just bargained away as part of a deal to end the war. So this is incredibly important to have more women judges, more women prosecutors, more women peace negotiators. And, you know, they're good at it. Women are used to negotiating arguments within their families and keeping people together. And yeah, I mean, it just makes sense.
Yeah, and also you were writing this book, you mentioned during the time that the Me Too movement became huge, and I think that just really showed how this is an issue we all need to talk about and care about and educate ourselves about. It's not just something that happens to women elsewhere, as you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, well, that's important because, you know, the Me Too thing, which really started, you know, with about Hollywood and actresses talking about what happened to them, And finally, Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood mogul, was brought to justice and has been imprisoned. But some commentators in my country, women commentators, wrote, the age of impunity for sexual crimes is dead. But actually, no, that it may be in Western countries that they're now. And it's also, let's not forget, these are the people that talked about Harvey Weinstein and how difficult it was for them to come forward. These are people with resources, who are educated, who have access to lawyers and media, and even for them it was really difficult. So imagine somebody in a Congolese village where the people perpetrating this are actually the people running the place, or are the people with the weapons, and how difficult it is to speak out, to do anything. And that's why they need international help, and this needs, countries that give aid to other countries should be making this part of the condition, saying as long as you don't do anything about widespread sexual violence in your country, we will not give aid to you. And so there are things that people can do, but unfortunately often other interests intervene.
I'm going to take questions now, Christina. There's Prabir Talukdar wants to ask, how do you strike a conversation with all these souls about their horrendous past?
That's a really good question, because actually, of course, the last thing you want to do, as I said earlier, these are really difficult things to talk about. The last thing that you want to do is re-traumatize somebody by making them talk about this all over again. And I was really worried about that. But what happened was that people were kind of self-selecting in a way, because I spoke to people who were already speaking out, who were fighting for justice. Right. Or I talked, for example, in some of the Yazidi camps, I spoke to the trauma therapists or psychologists and said, are there any women that, would be prepared to speak? And they sat in on the conversation, so that if there was a feeling that I was going into an area that we shouldn't go into, I never, I never pushed anybody to. It was very much them telling their story in the way that they wanted to, not asking kind of leading questions and things. And that meant, because these stories are difficult to tell and take a long while to tell. So sometimes, meant sitting many hours, days with people for them to tell. And I often said to people, do you want to stop? Because you don't have to go ahead with this. But, sometimes people, clearly was really difficult. But all of them insisted, no, I want people to know. And actually, the 16-year-old Yazidi girl I mentioned earlier, she said to me, I don't want anybody to be able to say I didn't know that this was happening.
That's so powerful. Rohini asks, you have seen some of the greatest atrocities that armed conflict and the human capacity for violent hatred has brought upon the world. Do you still have faith that all humans are capable of peace and compassion? How has your view on this changed over the years?
That's also an excellent question. I mean, the odd thing is, I have seen things I really wish I had never seen, and, horrible, evil in places. But I've also seen the most amazing people in these situations. I mean, in a strange way, in the darkest places, you see the brightest lights, people that have really, and often they're, people that no one knows about, ordinary people, housewives, shopkeepers, people doing a small thing in their area that is completely changing the lives of people. I mean, this beekeeper I talked about is just a very, very humble man, and yet he's saved more than 300 lives. And I think also it makes you realize that, I worked with Malala about, how one girl can make a difference, even in a, she was in a remote part of Pakistan. That is really true. You often think, oh, this is such a huge problem, we can't do anything about it. But one person can make a difference. It might start in a small way and locally. And so, and I do have, and funnily, when the coronavirus started, And, you know, all of a sudden, all of us had our lives changed almost overnight in a way that we could never have imagined. I felt more hopeful because I'd seen how people in terrible situations had coped. So I did think, yeah, people at the beginning with lockdown and the fear and thought, oh my God, what's going to happen? But actually people did cope, and, you know, like my street, people who I hardly knew, neighbours, suddenly all started helping each other. And so, you know, there was some positives from it.
Yeah, I think my
Not
favorite
that
part...
I don't wish it wouldn't go away.
Yes, that's a given, I think, for all of us at this point. I think my favorite part of the books like yours is the small acts of hospitality that are always coming up in the book, you know, getting a cup of tea or a glass of water from people who have almost nothing. For Ranjay Das asks, your most recent book, Our Bodies, a Battlefield, depicts the effects of war on women. In what ways do you believe that armed conflict has a global influence or impact on gender inequality?
Oh, sorry, I missed the last bit.
In what ways do you believe that armed conflict has a global influence or impact on gender inequality?
Well, I mean, this is the problem, that armed conflict, of course, makes things worse, because I think it's the women that suffer more in these situations. And, you know, unfortunately, sexual violence is a very cheap weapon, right? It doesn't cost anything. It's cheaper than a Kalashnikov, and it is very effective in places. You know, in Congo, militias that want to take over places that have minerals that actually, by the way, are things that we need in our mobile phones and iPads and laptops. They are using rape as a way of terrorizing the communities and making the women leave and the population leave so that they can take over the area. And, you know, sadly, it works. So that's the problem, and we've seen it over and over again. But I focused a lot on places where people were actually ordered to do it. Right? It wasn't because you know, obviously in the chaos of war, bad things happen, and sometimes people take advantage and loot and pillage and rape the women. But I was more interested, and you know, that's very hard to stop unless you've got more disciplined armies. But if, you know, a lot of the places I was talking about wasn't armies that were doing it, it was like local militia groups or terrorist groups. I mean, ISIS fighters were told that it is your duty to go and rape and take these Yazidi women. A good example is Bangladesh at the war, when Pakistan army also used rape on a wide scale. So it was very interesting to go, you know, while talking to the Rohingya women in Bangladesh, some of the Bangladeshi women I was talking to were like, actually, we know about this because this happened here in 71. And that's actually, Bangladesh is a really interesting example of, you know, what can we do about this? Because actually, when Bangladesh became independent, Sheikh Mujib, the first leader, he talked about these women and said they were heroes and they should be treated well and regarded as much as heroes of the war as the people that fought. But sadly, he was then assassinated and a more Islamist regime took over. And these women had been identified because they'd been spoken of as heroes. So that really backfired because it meant that they'd been branded in a way. And so all the centres that had been set up for them at the beginning then all had to kind of go underground. And women were had pushed out of their communities. And some of those women that I met, you know, all these years on, I mean, they'd lived almost 50 years, it is now, in basically almost in hiding and shame of what had happened to them. And that's just so sad and wrong.
In your book, you've mentioned how slowly there's attempts to break the silence around that and how difficult that is. I think that's all we have the time for now, unfortunately, Christina. But thank you so much for this fascinating and very important session, and I look forward to hearing the rest of your virtual tour with this book. Over to you,
Thanks.
Ankur.
Thanks everyone for listening and caring.
Thank you, Christina and Taran, for such an intriguing session. And thank you all for watching and being a terrific audience. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK and the Murthy Family Foundation for supporting the festival. We hope that you will stay with us throughout the day and watch all the fantastic sessions that we have in store for you. Our next session coming up shortly is Virology and Race. Angela Saini, Ajit Lalwani, and Roger Highfield in conversation. We now present a reading from the Jaipur Writer Short Series featuring Guinevere June Howell from the Swansea University.
Hello, my name is Guinevere Clark and I'm a creative writing student at Swansea University. I'm studying for a PhD and my main form is poetry, working along the lines of maternity, single parenting and gender inequality. So thank you for inviting me to the festival, and I've got 2 poems to share today. Walking the line. She couldn't put her finger on it all when she came out of hospital. Birth done. The tulips had opened, stamens to the sun, but the washing was still on the line, waving at her tired eye, half undone. And my second poem is called Always There. Always there. You said you'd always be there for our son. Skype. Can you check a fever on the wire? Listen through the ether for his cry at night? Grow a hand, stream it to flick on the lights. Will you reach for his shadow? Carve him from snow? Know exactly when his blood needs fluid. You don't see him, smiling, his mirror skin stretched around baubles, angel clear, singing for Jack Frost by the fire. Or smell him, the pine and urine, his first sweat and tooth blood. We wrap you, a present, in the carpet's glitter, the stains that echo from your boots. Slide your box like a casket under our new Poundland tree, the cheapest in Swansea, arching for the ceremony. Thank you very much.